Now we're going to call on Ken Weinstein, Caitrin Kuiper, and Leon Kass to talk about our Mother of Valor, Amy Kass. And we'll start with Ken. Thank you.
Good evening. I am honored and humbled to speak this evening in memory of my beloved friend Amy Kass. In preparing these remarks, the first sentiment I felt was the immense and painful void of her absence, a sentiment still very acute 2.5 years after her death. Amy had been a force in my life ever since the fall of 1980, when I arrived as a know-it-all monetarist first year at the University of Chicago who thought that the forces of economics, the laws of economics, could explain the mysteries of life. But Dr. and Mrs. Kass, legendary figures on campus, had something else in mind for this young disciple of Milton Friedman and for generations of others in the college. Through a wonderful course they devised, Human Being and Citizen, they opened our eyes to a world beyond market incentives, to philosophical horizons of inquiry in Plato, Aristotle, Hobbes, Rousseau, Lincoln, Tocqueville, the American founders, and others. Now, I never ended up, in the end, taking a course in economics in college, much to the regret of my bank account, my wife, my children, my eventual grandchildren. But I also never studied with the Kasses. I confess I became an Allen Bloom student, and studying with the Kasses was, well, something we did not do. It was therefore my great good fortune, literally a quarter century later, to get a second chance to learn from the woman I thought of as Mrs. Kass, when she joined Hudson Institute in 2005 to work with Bill Shambra in our Bradley Center on Philanthropy. Now, at first glance, the legendary Mrs. Kass, who taught the great books, was hardly a natural fit for a think tank. Who, after all, at a think tank reads great books? I have a couple of colleagues in those days who were delusional enough to think that their own books belonged in the canon. And the policy world, after all, can be a world, they tell me, of certainty and dogma. A world not unlike that inhabited by the very economists the Kasses inspired me to leave behind. But just as Human Being and Citizen opened my eyes, Amy's work with Bill Shambra at the Bradley Center, later with my wife Amy in the Hudson Pew series on Capitol Hill, and even later in her classes with her beloved Leon and John Walter's political studies program, helped open the eyes of dozens of practitioners, philanthropists, Capitol Hill staffers, and college students to see beyond their own preconceptions to a more nuanced understanding through close textual study of an assigned selection from Aristotle, Hawthorne, Tocqueville, Lincoln, W.E.B. Du Bois, always indirect, never immediately on a subject of contemporary controversy, but it was through Amy's magisterial yet nearly invisible hand in discussing these readings that the most assured of Washington insiders, left and right, were brought to realize just how much more complex the world actually is, seeing gray where they only saw black or white. Amy led these practitioners or these students to return to their work or their classroom with a more tempered appreciation of the theoretical frameworks they once took as written in stone. How much we could have used her in this Twitter-crazed world. Amy was able to do this because she had a unique and particularly attractive set of characteristics. She was profoundly insightful about mankind and our fate in the broadest sense, yet also about the psychology of the men, women, and children around her. And the very qualities that made her a master in drawing out students' texts and ideas in the classroom made her a wonderful and generous friend, willing to share her insights with those she loved. Conversations with Amy could be wide-ranging, but they invariably led to deeper reflections, whether on life, on marriage, on offspring, on children, or on colleagues. And I especially treasure her friendship with my Amy, how they discussed novels, the Jewish home, the raising of children, some of the more challenging personalities around us. And Amy's profound insights on our three children, especially in challenging times, were always a source of strength to us. When Amy was in good health, she was a regular at our Shabbat table, a grandmother, in essence, to our children. After our mothers passed away, someone who could hold each of them in fascinating conversation, teaching them as well as teaching us about them as individuals. And she was in so many ways the mother that we wish we had had. To the very end, Amy was serious about serious things, but never lost perspective, which she expressed through a charming playfulness that at times bordered on impishness about matters big and small, whether with our children or with adults. Even in our final visits with her, these qualities were evident in the gratitude and incredible joy on her face as her body failed her, and in the loving way she continued to tease Leon at the most poignant of their moments in their 55 years together. Many of you know our teenage son was also in cancer treatment at this time. As they visited for a last time, Harry was bald, bluish, and weighed maybe 100 pounds. After comparing notes, Amy joked in her dying state that at least she looked better than he did. Laughing heartily, even in immense pain, accepting death with grace. Amy Cass, in short, was anything but the stuffy Mrs. Cass I conjured up in my imagination in the early 1980s. That stuffy Mrs. Cass might have appreciated the painful void that I spoke of at the outset, but I think the Amy Cass I know of would have loved for us to remember her with the gratitude and the joy that with which she lived her life. Thank you.
The last time I ever saw Amy, I was 5 months pregnant with my son. I went to say goodbye to one of my very favorite people, even as I was preparing to say hello to another one. And I thought that, as a special treat, I could tell her we were going to have a boy. My husband and I had found that out ourselves, but we weren't going to announce it until he was born. But because I knew that she would know how much it meant to me to have a child, and because she wasn't going to get to meet him and find out with everybody else, I wanted to tell her early. "What did you have to go and find that out for?" she said. She apparently believed that such matters should always be a wonderful surprise, and she was not impressed. And for the privilege of being scolded by her in that moment, I would do it all again. The first time I ever saw Amy was 10 years before that, when I was a freshman at the University of Chicago, and I snuck into her class where I was not supposed to be. She stared me up and down and sternly informed me that she would expect the highest standards. Then, too, the upbraiding was somehow welcome. But I had no idea what it was that I was going to learn. I only knew that she was legendary, and so I should try to take advantage of the opportunity, because that's just what you do. But what she had to offer was unlike most of what you learn at university. She did not educate us to be monks of the ivory tower, but to be human beings and citizens, to live real lives that were bigger than the books we studied, but meaningfully informed by them. She was not interested in critical frameworks to distance us from the text, but pointed questions to plunge us into them. The organizing principle was usually the characters. What are they doing and thinking and feeling, and why? This sympathetic outlook overflowed into a far more than professorly care for her students as people, wanting for us to live lives as happy and fulfilling as hers had been, trying to give us the tools to make that happen as a teacher, and taking a warm and active interest in us as a friend. Many of us, myself included, were fortunate enough to remain in touch with her for years beyond our graduation. And being born to teach, like birds are born to fly, even when off the clock from the university, she was leading discussion groups here in DC, at the Hudson Institute, at her home, anywhere that she could take the chance. In Leon's foreword to the book that you've all received, he tells the hilarious story of how her teaching career began. I can tell you how it ended. Amy was a faithful Jew who happened to love Christmas stories. Possibly because she once had a baby on Christmas Day herself. In addition to her series at Hudson on philanthropy and civic renewal, on Moby Dick and Middlemarch, and on the American character in story, speech, and song, every holiday season she led a reading group on a Christmas story. We did some classics, including one time the entirety of A Christmas Carol, but there were some strange and bleak ones mixed in there as well, such as the last one in December 2014, Christmas Gift by Robert Penn Warren. Set in the Depression, the story features an almost feral boy sent out to fetch a doctor for his older sister, and the rough around the edges men he meets along the way. Despite the title, the word Christmas does not appear throughout this story, nor is there even any hint of it except the stick of candy cane the boy is given and in turn shares with the doctor. But in the background of these interactions, there's the sister, who is bringing a baby into the world under unexpected and stressful circumstances. Viewed in one way, this baby seems like a burden to a family that is not even holding it together in the first place. But like any baby, and not coincidentally like the original Christmas story, this baby brings with it the promise of renewal in the world. Your support tonight for other such babies and their brave mothers is a practical extension of Amy's caring nature and her understanding of where our hope for the future is to come from. As much as I miss her every day, her spirit lives on in the world in these mitzvahs and in the knowledge that even out of the saddest endings, there are born new beginnings.